Thank you for that. Vanessa, let's welcome you to the program then. And, well, what's the latest from the Middle East?
Well, I'm going to focus on the Lebanon quote-unquote ceasefire negotiation. Amos Hochstein is currently in Beirut trying to broker a deal, of course, just as he regularly did regarding Israel and Gaza. So Lebanon and Hezbollah agreed to U.S. proposal for a ceasefire with Israel, Lebanese official says. So this is in Reuters, the font of all knowledge from many of the mainstream media outlets. UN Resolution 1701 is the focus of the diplomacy. And then let's have a look at what they continue to say. So Ali Hassan Khalil, an aide to Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri, said Lebanon had delivered its written response to the US ambassador in Lebanon on Monday, and White House envoy Amos Hochstein was traveling to Beirut to continue talks. There was no immediate comment from Israel. Hezbollah, and this is Reuters, remember, a heavily armed movement backed by Iran, of course, endorsed its longtime ally Berri to negotiate over a ceasefire. Lebanon presented its comments on the paper in a positive atmosphere. All the comments we presented affirm the precise adherence to UN Resolution 1701 with all its provisions. Now, you'll see later in the Reuters article, which is the next slide, basically, that the focus when Western media talk about Resolution 1701, which ended a previous war between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006, they focus on the fact that the terms of 1701 require Hezbollah to have no armed presence in the area between the Lebanese-Israeli border and the Litani River, which runs some 30 kilometers, 20 miles north of the frontier. This is what you will hear about, and that's why I wanted to do this section today, to go into greater depth on Resolution 1701 and what it actually means for Israel as well. Israel has long claimed that Resolution 1701 was never properly implemented, pointing to the presence of Hezbollah fighters and weapons along the border. Lebanon has accused Israel of violations, including flying warplanes in its airspace. Notice how that is put in very much as an addendum. It's not a focal point, and that is then reflected in all the media reports, including BBC, CNN, etc. So to basically demonstrate 1701's reality, I just took this post on X from Middle East Observer. I recommend following them. They do good work on deciphering, particularly Western media reporting on the Middle Eastern events. So if we look at, sorry, is this?
Yeah,
we've gone back to Reuters.
That's a duplicate slide.
That's my fault. Yeah. Sorry, my bad. So if we move a slide on, sorry, that confused me for a second. Israel's continuous breach of Clause 1. So let's have a look at 1 and 2, the first two clauses. Calls for a full cessation of hostilities based upon, in particular, the immediate cessation by Hezbollah of all attacks and the immediate cessation by Israel of all offensive military operations. This is a very important point. 2, upon full cessation of hostilities, calls upon the government of Lebanon and UNIFIL, the UN peacekeepers, as authorized by paragraph 11, to deploy their forces together throughout the south, and calls upon the government of Israel, as that deployment begins, to withdraw all of its forces from southern Lebanon in parallel. Again, very important. So then let's have a look at what he mentions about this. The cessation of hostilities, very different to a ceasefire, is a non-binding announcement by one or both sides to suspend fighting, which may be a step towards peace negotiations. Cessations of hostilities are usually less structured than ceasefires and may not cover issues like timelines, security, or objectives. The first point calls for a full cessation of hostilities. Hezbollah stopped firing at Israel and engaging in hostilities. However, Israel never stopped its air, land, and sea breaches. Israeli warplanes never stopped flying over Lebanon since 2006. Cessation of hostilities breach. 22,111 Israeli military aircraft have violated Lebanese airspace from 2007 to 2022. Not counting numerous land and sea breaches. So let's have a look at the Israel's breach of Clause 2, which is full withdrawal from Lebanese territory. There are 13 contested border points between the occupation and Lebanon, 7 of which Israel recognizes as Lebanese, but they haven't vacated those areas of Lebanese territory. For the sake of simplicity, we will discuss the clearest non-disputable violation. Israel occupied the Lebanese part of the Gaza village in the 2006 war and never withdrew from it. Israel recognizes that this is Lebanese land. In November 2010, the Israeli cabinet agreed in principle to withdraw from the town, but they have never done so. And then if we have a look at the map here that shows clearly, I highlighted it in red, the Sheba Farm territories, which is Lebanese territory that Israel occupied with the Syrian Golan Heights in 1967. Israel refuses to withdraw from it on the basis that there's ambiguity whether it's Lebanese or Syrian territory. I'm not quite sure what difference that makes. However, Lebanon did submit documents proving that it's Lebanese territory, but Israel has never vacated that particular territory, nor has it, of course, left the occupied Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory. Now, what's interesting, this article was published in the last 2 days in the Jerusalem Post. Southern Lebanon is actually northern Israel opinion. And this is based, of course, on the religious argumentation that southern Lebanon was promised to the Zionists. Now, what's interesting, this article or a similar one was published by Jerusalem Post a few weeks ago and then rapidly withdrawn. So clearly the timing was not right for them to be putting out this kind of propaganda. Again, he goes on, if Israel is not ill-intended and wants to strip Hezbollah of its narrative, why is it occupying Lebanon and breaching its sovereignty? If it's not important and just small villages in relation to the flyovers by Lebanese aircraft, why doesn't Israel withdraw and stop its aggression on Lebanon? Why the constant stubbornness to violate clauses 1 and 2? Because Israel is an aggressor, expansionist state that seeks total military security and political dominance over all countries in the region, and it's not hidden neither by the USA nor by Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon have never breached Resolution 1701. They're still waiting for Israel to abide by the first 2 clauses. So, and then he kind of finishes off, if we can just, knowing Israel's nature, it will not accept to implement Resolution 1701 as it is, because Israel has been breaching this resolution every day since 2006. Will Israel accept now to get out of Lebanon, including Gaza Village, the 7 points, and kickstart the process of the withdrawal from the Sheba Farms that, in my view, also has implications on their occupation of Syrian territory in the Golan? This is absolutely not happening. Lebanon, by saying it wants to implement Resolution 1701, shows that it's Israel that does not actually want to stop the war. And so effectively what Hezbollah is saying, if Israel were to, for example, broker a realistic ceasefire with Gaza and the West Bank, then Hezbollah would stop firing and 1701 would probably remain in place as it is. So the status quo would remain the same. If Israel only wants to broker a deal with Lebanon, 1701 will be enforced with all the implications for Israel having to relinquish territory that it's occupied since 1967 and 2006. So this is from the cradle. So Israel provided the US with a document last week detailing its conditions for a diplomatic solution to end its war in Lebanon. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office gave the paper to the White House ahead of President Biden's envoy Amos Hochstein's visit to Beirut on Monday to discuss the diplomatic solution. Ron Dermer, Israel's Minister for Strategic Affairs, sent the document to Amos Hochstein last week ahead of his planned trip to Lebanon. According to the document, so here we have Israel again adding clauses to an already existing document, Israel is demanding that its forces be permitted to carry out active enforcement inside Lebanese territory. This aims to ensure that the Lebanese resistance does not rearm and rebuild close to the border, one of the officials said. And a following article from the Cradle goes on in this vein. If we can just move on to the next one. Yep. The amendments proposed by Hochstein to Resolution 1701 reveal Israel's broader strategy of using international mechanisms to further its objectives. These changes would extend UNIFIL's jurisdiction 2 kilometers north of the Litani River, allowing international forces to conduct searches, patrols, and inspections without requiring approval from Lebanese authorities. These inspections can include searching vehicles, private properties, and suspected weapon sites. Effectively, this is a demand for Lebanon to cede control over its own territory, a clear infringement on its sovereignty. Under the guise of peacekeeping, this would grant Israel indirect control over Lebanon's internal security dynamics, especially since intelligence for those operations may be influenced by or even originate from Israeli sources. So, we have a very familiar pattern here, very, very similar to what was going on in Gaza. Israel acting as an honest broker when in reality it's trying to basically include new expansion of its own influence and power inside Lebanon under the guise of adhering to the original resolution.
Something that strikes me, Vanessa, is that no matter what position you take on the Ukraine war or on the Middle East, we have a Western international rules-based order which says that Russia has no entitlement to run a special military operation across the border in Ukraine in order to create a sort of demilitarized zone between Ukraine, a buffer between Ukraine and Russia. But Israel does have the right to do that in South Lebanon, apparently seems to be what's going on here. How are these two positions compatible?
Well, they're not compatible, nor were the West's positions over Kosovo, of course. The alleged, Kosovo independence. So the hypocrisy is rank, but we should be pretty used to it by now.
Absolutely. Okay, well, Vanessa, let's come back to you then. And, Israel has been receiving Hezbollah attacks.
Yeah, basically with the negotiations underway, we've described, we can just run this clip while I'm talking. Israel has increased and expanded its attacks into central Beirut. Of course, previously it was attacking Dahe, the southern suburb. Many of the refugees that were displaced from the southern suburbs into central Beirut are now also being affected by the expansion of Israeli attacks into Christian areas, into residential areas, murdering or assassinating the head of Hezbollah's media department, so effectively a journalist, not a combatant. This has been collated since, I guess it's since October the 1st when Israel began its expansion of aggression into Lebanon. 190 martyred medics, including civil defense. Actual civil defense centers have been bombed on a regular basis, particularly recently. 55 hospitals have been targeted, some put out of operation altogether. 246 ambulances. Now, in return for this expansion by Israel, bearing in mind this is all related to the pressure that's being put on by both Hezbollah and Israel during the negotiations for some kind of cessation of hostilities. Hezbollah missiles pummel Tel Aviv, numerous wounded and killed. So let's just run again a video showing some of those missiles that landed and were not intercepted.
Apple fila de pezzot. Why? No tengo pan, pego,
Apparently this was the first time that Hezbollah used this particular kind of ballistic missile. And as I say, having the reinforcements of the THAAD interceptors from the US were unable to prevent impact. This is from Amal Saad, who's a professor at the American University in Beirut. Today, as I mentioned, Israel assassinated Mohammed Afif, Hezbollah's media head, killing him along with other civilians in a Christian residential neighborhood of Beirut. Of course, this is part of Israel's attempts to turn factions within Lebanon against Hezbollah, so far very much failing, apart from those factions that are already very much aligned with the Zionist entity. Beyond its clear violations of international humanitarian law, targeting a journalist, the timing of this assassination exposes Israel's strategic failures. They have, of course, failed to move forward in the south, and reflects a campaign fueled by desperation and a desire for retribution. She goes on to say, setting aside all moral, ethical, and legal considerations and judging Israel's actions purely through the cold, pragmatic lens of realpolitik, this war is set to end not only without achieving any of its objectives, but with Israel emerging significantly weaker. This is because the historically unparalleled scale of violence that it has unleashed against Gaza and Lebanon has exhausted nearly all conceivable methods of force, leaving it with nothing further to escalate, except, of course, nuclear. Such overreach follows the law of diminishing returns, where greater violence yields increasingly limited results, ultimately undermining its strategic position. We can talk about that a bit more in extra, but never fear, because the British envoy in Israel says that the UK will put its own personnel in harm's way to defend Israel from Iran. And of course, bearing in mind that every single resistance faction is determined to be nothing more than a proxy of Iran. The UK will protect Israel again should Iran attack, says British envoy to Israel. The United Kingdom will be a close ally and is prepared to put its own aircraft and its own personnel in harm's way to defend Israel, says Ambassador Simon Walters, speaking to Israeli journalists at his Ramat Gan residence. He notes that the Royal Air Force flew alongside Israeli and US pilots during the April Iranian missile and drone attack on Israel, and adds, without going into detail, on October the 1st, the British Armed Forces again played a role in trying to disrupt the Iranian attack on Israel. This is quite extraordinary, that basically he's putting forward British army personnel to defend another country. And this was back in February 2024, when the BBC even pointed out that the UK's armed forces will not be ready for a high-intensity war unless shortages in personnel and equipment are rapidly addressed. And of course, Mike, you've been talking about this extensively on UK Column, and not forgetting that the Ergun and Stern Zionist terrorist gangs carried out several attacks against British forces from 1946 onwards, and yet we're expected to put our British military personnel at risk to defend Israel.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. And